Welcome to the Stop Down Photography Podcast, Episode 4. I'm your host, Scott Davenport, and today's topic is what George Harrison taught me about photography. Hey gang, welcome to the podcast. Thanks for spending a few minutes of your day with me. So, if the title of this podcast didn't suggest it, yes, I am a Beatles fan, and I want to talk a bit about music before we get into the photography side of things, but there's a real connection here. But to lay some groundwork, give you some context here. The Beatles came and went before I was ever born, right? But as they say, the music lives on. And in my formative years, I connected with the music of the Beatles. I'd been into music before I was ever into photography. I've owned every Beatles album on vinyl. I've worn through them. I've gone down the rabbit hole of Beatles fandom. I know the lyrics to the songs. I know the trivia, the little things on the albums, the Paul is dead theories, all that sorts of stuff. And I guess you could say I really liked to learn more about behind the music, behind the scenes. I read a really interesting book called Here, There, and Everywhere. It's by Geoff Emerick, and he was the sound engineer on many of the Beatles records, kind of starting around the Revolver stage and just after Rubber Soul. This is where they became much more of an experimental group. They weren't doing touring anymore, and it's kind of the era of their songs that really do resonate and live on. Yes, I Want to Hold Your Hand is a catchy song, but when people think of the Beatles, they think a lot more about the work in their later years. Revolution, Sgt. Pepper, those things. And that's where Geoff Emerick came in. Now, Jeff's an unsung hero in the Beatles world. He's the guy that made many of their groundbreaking sounds possible. What he did with microphone placement and compressions and the post work in music, flying in live broadcasts from the BBC. I mean, I can go on and on and on about this stuff, but that's not the purpose of it. What I want to talk about is George Harrison and a story from Jeff's book about George that changed the way I treat my photography. Now, George is a great songwriter, although much of his time in the Beatles, I'd argue, he was at a disadvantage, a pretty significant one. He stood in the shadow of Lennon and McCartney, the powerhouse songwriting duo. There's no doubt that John and Paul wrote great songs. Meanwhile, George is off on his own. He didn't have a writing partner to bounce things off, and he wrote lots and lots of songs that never saw the light of day as Beatles tracks. I mean, some of his work came through. Taxman is a good one. While My Guitar Gently Weeps, a classic. But by the time the Beatles broke up, his first solo record, All Things Must Pass, it was a triple album. He had all of this material built up and ready to be recorded. Now, how is this connecting to photography? So by the end of the Beatles era, this is late 1960s, they're in the studio, they're recording for what would become the final album, Abbey Road. Now, George does a demo of the song Something. This is arguably one of the best love songs ever written, and everybody knows it. The band knows it, the recording engineers know it. The demo track itself, with just George and his guitar, is amazing. No doubt, it's a great song. As the sessions go on and George is refining the work, Paul comes over to say, hey, I got some ideas for you. Let me share some thoughts about this song. Now, take a moment, take stock of this. This is Paul McCartney we're talking about, a guy that knows his songwriting. He comes over to offer another songwriter some notes. This is advice from what I would call a trusted source, someone worthwhile to listen to. Now, as Paul is sharing these notes, George stops him mid-sentence and simply says, I think it's good the way it is. That was it. End of conversation. The song was George's. It was his art. And it's that moment, that's what was powerful to me, and that's what I incorporate into my photography. Now, here's the connection, right? Like all photographers, I share my work online. I share my work with other photographers. I ask for feedback from photographers whose opinions I value. However, It's always up to me whether or not to make a change based on the feedback I get. Now, I'm not saying I will always discount feedback. That's not the point. Feedback, critique, we need that to grow. Listen actively, consider the input, and give it measured thought. However, there is nothing saying constructive criticism or even negative feedback needs to be accepted. Maybe I made a composition choice that purposely creates tension. The focal length choice might not be to someone's liking. Post-processing choices, that's a fertile ground for differing opinions on what is quote-unquote good for a photo. But my point is, if someone's input is not in line with the vision I had for a photo, I don't have to change it. My art is my own. I have the final word. And I can say, I think it's good the way it is. And George Harrison taught me that. Skimming through the news articles like I do each week, something that seems to be a recurring theme every few months or so, it comes up about how do you measure your own growth as an artist. And an article on F-Stoppers I thought was very well stated, which is something I've talked about with other photographers as well, is when you're comparing your work and trying to gauge, have you grown? It's best to compare yourself to yourself. I'll put the link in the show notes below. It was like how to evaluate yourself and stay on track, I think was the title of the article. It's asking questions like, do I like who I am now compared to who I was before as a photographer? Has my work gotten better? Or am I just kind of on autopilot mailing things in? Have I taken steps toward growth? Have I tried to do something new? Have I stayed stagnant? Have I gotten worse? We're still in early 2020, and this is a good time to take a look at the photos you took in 2019 and compare them to photos you took in 2018. This actually brings up another thought. I'm going to have to write this one down for metadata being a way to help you grow as an artist, because I leverage the metadata in my catalog of photos extensively, and using it to measure yourself against yourself is very helpful. So I'm going to have to put that one down. That's another good topic, but not to get too far off the rails on this. My point is we can go and see wonderful photos from all sorts of photographers online. And those are great sources of inspiration. The trick is not to compare yourself to another photographer that is too different from you. I like the idea of looking at other people's work, watching their tutorial videos if it's post-processing, or watching their field videos of how they approach a scene to inspire me and give me ideas to fuel my own creativity. Where it gets potentially dangerous is if you're saying, I'm not as good as this person. I'm not creating the same photos they are. Well, of course you're not. You're a different person. Right? So it's kind of like music, to tie it back to the Beatles and George. I've picked up a guitar. I've played guitar for a bunch of years. I'm not going to play like George Harrison. I'm not going to play that well at all, quite honestly. But it would be wrong for me to try to compare myself to the great guitarists of the last 50 years. However, for me to go and listen to something, maybe I recorded something 10 years ago on guitar, and then now I play it. If I've improved, if I can tell, the transitions between chords are cleaner, notes in the solo are cleaner, well, then I have improved as a guitarist. Same thing for photography. Compare your work to your previous work. Have you grown? Have your tastes shifted? There's lots of different ways to look for patterns, look for growth, or look for opportunities for improvement. But comparing yourself to yourself, it's very important. Thanks to the supporters on Patreon. If you are a Patreon member, there is a little behind the scenes video for this podcast there. You can get a glimpse of what the recording area looks like, and you can see what is going on behind the scenes for recording this podcast. It is your support that makes this podcast possible and helping thousands of others enjoy photography. If you're interested in learning more about the Patreon community, check the show notes, and there's a button on all the pages of stopdownpodcast.com where you can learn more. Well, that wraps up this week's episode. I hope you enjoyed the George Harrison story and it makes you more comfortable owning your own art. You make that creative choice that you really believe in and you are very happy with the work, then own it. It's yours and you can listen to feedback, but you don't necessarily have to take it all. If you enjoyed today's podcast, please rate and review it on Apple Podcasts, subscribe to your podcast feed. You can also find episodes on stopdownpodcast.com, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts. I'm working on another topic for next week, and until then, my name's Scott Davenport. Have fun.